Good morning, everybody. Happy Hump Day. I'm delighted that you have joined us for June's edition of peopleHUB. My name is Victoria Brown. I am the chair of peopleHUB and also the founder of 1HR. As you know, if you've joined us for recent sessions, we talked about menopause not so long ago in the workplace, and then also neurodiversity was our last session. So it made perfect sense, particularly in Pride Month, to pull it all together and talk about equality and diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And I'm delighted that I have Pippa Marler and Sophie Clark, who are both EDI experts, who are going to have a panel discussion shortly. I'm going to let them do their intro and tell you all about them and their background and their experience. But before we do, we'll just have a 5-minute networking session. We're just going to cut it down to 5 minutes because we've got a lot to get through. And I'm sure you've got a lot of questions to ask of Pippa and Sophie too. So if you've been before, you know the drill. What we will do now is Dan will just randomly place us in a room with 1 or 2 other people, just an opportunity to get to know the community. And then we've just got 5 minutes and then we will bob back out and I will hand over to Sophie and Pippa. Okay, well, I hope you had a good little networking session then. I'm sorry it's short, but I think you'll appreciate that so that we can get more time with our experts today. So before we do hand over, just a reminder, if you have been on peopleHUB before, you can ask questions, put them into the into the inbox, and I will filter them through and ask Pippa and Sophie at the end those questions. Or what you can do is you actually take, and I remember to do this myself today, you can take a picture on screen now of the QR code and just follow that. We do use Slido, which has actually been really good in other sessions. You can ask questions, or if there's a question that you think, oh, that's relevant and I want to know that answer as well. If you also tick on it, it'll come to the top, so we'll know that's the most interested question. So I'm going to now hand over to Pippa and Sophie. So I think obviously the first thing which would be fantastic is if we can maybe hand over to Pippa first, and could you just let us know a little bit about you, Pippa, and your experience and why you're in EDI?
So I had a roughly 20-year career working in law. I was a costs lawyer. That was kind of my first job out of university. Unintentionally, one of those things that just sort of happened, got a temping job and then never managed to escape until many years later, and through I got to the point where I don't want to be a lawyer anymore. There's no sort of satisfaction for me in it anymore, so I moved into an HR role. It was quite circuitously, but in Waitman's Solicitors, and ended up in recruitment, which I wasn't expecting to enjoy as much as I did. I was kind of just helping out. And then while I was in the role of recruitment, I started seeing more and more things that didn't really add up in terms of equity and opportunity. We would have, there was a tendency for female applicants to undersell themselves, whereas the archetypal white male middle-class lawyer would oversell themselves, and even to the point where I would surreptitiously have conversations with candidates and say, you are able to negotiate, don't just accept the first offer that's made. And separately to that, I was having conversations with various people across the business, because it was a large organization, 1,500 people, about what we could do on a more sort of people level as to inclusion and networks, and even just getting involved in Liverpool Pride and things like that. And I started, because I am quite passionate about equality and quite outspoken, started sort of canvassing the HR director and the HR managers. Why aren't we doing this? Why have we got a gender pay gap when at our very first level, not just across business, but even within the sort of new recruit NQ lawyer stage? and started making a nuisance of myself, really. And through that became the first EDI manager for Waitmans, which was a baptism of fire, but really interesting, fantastic opportunity. Got to build an action plan, policies and procedures, an events calendar, networks, a EDI group of senior management all the way down to apprentice level, and really just built it from the ground up with no blueprint of how it was done before, because it wasn't done before. Learned a hell of a lot, and then, after learning a hell of a lot, moved into housing, which was a completely new sector for me. Didn't know really anything about housing, but the principles of how to build an inclusive organisation are more or less the same. I've been there a year now, and again, starting from the ground up, building the action plan, building the networks, reviewing all policies, procedures, and procurement processes, just everything and anything, and also managing their well-being, which wasn't actually part of the job description. I seem to have inherited an additional role, but that's the nice bit, and that's a lot of fun. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey, and I have to say I feel a million times happier than when I was a lawyer.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's brilliant. Oh, thank you, Pippa. And Sophie, what about you? What about your story so far?
Thank you, Victoria. So I entered the world of work when I was about 15, 16. And obviously at that age, you don't really know what to expect. I started off in hospitality, and I just used to hear loads of comments. And I think I must have grown up in a bit of an echo chamber where I wasn't really around that. So when I was hearing people say quite offensive things about each other or about customers, I was thinking, is this normal? Am I the problem? And sort of trying to stand up against it, but not really having the power and people not really listening. And then as I moved into other roles, I moved into marketing and then later sales and customer service administration. It just kind of always seemed to happen. There'd always be sort of comments made and kind of microaggressions. And I wanted to be an ally and stand up to it, but when I tried, it was shut down. And I felt like I didn't have the tools and the power to really address it in the correct way. Which is why I started looking into EDI and trying to learn more and learn about active allyship and different characteristics, and really kind of educate myself so I knew how to address these things. Alongside that, I was studying sociology at uni, and then later on did a master's in international relations. So both very sort of socially aware subjects, and we were kind of examining hidden biases and intersectionality and the nuances involved in discrimination and oppression and things like that. So it really lended itself to a career in EDI. So after I finished my master's, I was looking for EDI jobs, and luckily Kyra, actually, who's on the call now, who I work with, reached out to me and let me know about an opening at the Equal Group for an EDI consultant role. And it was just perfect. It kind of matched all my skills, and the values of the organisation really matched what I was looking for. And I've been at the Equal Group about a year now, helping various clients at different points of their journey. I tend to work mostly with public sector organisations, but we do sort of mix and match depending on the project. But we do EDI audits, training, policy reviews, bespoke services. So I've kind of had a lot of experience across a range of different clients and organisations at different stages of their EDI journeys. One thing I really enjoy, although the quant data side is really important, I enjoy the focus groups and the interviews and really getting that qualitative data and understanding people's lived experiences. Firstly, to learn more about them, but also I think to tackle the complexities of EDI, it's really good to understand different people's experiences and not sort of reduce it to less than it is, because lived experience is always so complex. So yeah, that's where I'm at now, just continuing working at the Equal Group, doing EDI consultancy.
Sorry, I'm muted. Fantastic. Well, should we just stay with you for a minute, Sophie? Because I think the best place to probably start is the Equality Act. So obviously we've got a mixed sort of room. Some people are sort of HR directors, some people are business owners. So if you could just sort of let people understand and what the Equality Act is and sort of take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Equality Act 2010 brought together a lot of other legislation. And the idea was that it would bring it all together and kind of combine all the previous legislation to form one big piece of legislation that would protect people from discrimination, victimization, and harassment in various areas of life, including school and work. So within the workplace, the Equality Act kind of underpins a lot of EDI interventions. It doesn't cover everything, but it definitely acts as a framework. And there are 9 protected characteristics outlined, which I believe Pippa will go through later. But in terms of the sort of definitions of discrimination, harassment and victimization, discrimination can be split into 2 different distinct areas. With direct discrimination, it's about actively treating someone less favorably due to one or more of their protected characteristics. Direct discrimination can also be the opposite. It can be sort of positive and putting someone on a pedestal based on their protected characteristics. But the idea is that it's more overt, more obvious, whereas indirect is where sort of policies that apply to everyone can potentially put a person or a group with protected characteristics at an unfair disadvantage. And often this is where we see in the EDI space, discrimination happening without organisations really realising. And that's why policy reviews are so important and just viewing everything through that EDI lens. I think this also points a little bit to the difference between equality and equity. So when we say EDI, most people are thinking equality, diversity and inclusion, but actually the equity part is really important. So whereas equality is looking at being equal in terms of status, rights, opportunities, equity takes into account sort of respective needs and being fair to all people. So generally, if you can get equity right, it will lead to equality, but both of them are important to keep in mind. And then in terms of harassment and victimization, harassment is about repeated behaviour that sort of violates someone's dignity or creates an offensive environment. Often microaggressions can be considered harassment, depending on the context. And then victimization is one that I think is sometimes misunderstood, but it's actually about treating someone unfairly because they've raised concerns in the past about discrimination. And the fear of victimization may often hold people back from raising those concerns.
Thanks, Sophie. That was fantastic. Obviously, you mentioned protected characteristics there. And as a HR professional, I'm quite shocked sometimes by, we ask the question, you know, it's one of the first questions you ask if there's ever a performance issue. It's sort of like, what's the service? And is there any protected characteristics? And the amount of people that don't know even what a protected characteristic is. So Pippa, could you please tell us all about protected characteristics, please?
I certainly can. I just feel like I ought to explain that I've got a new puppy and she's currently eating everything. So I've had to get her onto my knee so that she doesn't do that. So if I'm looking a little bit fidgety, that's why. So yeah, like you say, Victoria, I'm always surprised by, you know, the lack of knowledge and understanding around protected characteristics. And what I found really interesting at an event I was at recently, someone pointed out that everybody usually has at least 5 protected characteristics themselves. So the basics are that, you know, as Sophie said, it's illegal to discriminate against anyone because of a protected characteristic. They include age, gender reassignment, which means you do not identify as the gender you were assigned at birth. That could be either trans or non-binary or gender fluid. From the community, gender is very much viewed as a spectrum. It's not a binary or black and white thing. Being married or in a civil partnership, being pregnant or on maternity leave, and that for most organisations, I believe now, will encompass adoption leave. There are separate legislations around adoption, but for the purposes of an EDI strategy or action plan, you will be wanting to include adoption in your maternity and pregnancy policies. Disability, which includes mental and physical disabilities, and would normally, and this is another one, quite often I think when people are answering questionnaires around having a disability, people will say they don't have a disability because they don't know what the strict definition of a disability is. And That is, anything that restricts or impacts your ability to do day-to-day activities for a prolonged period of time. And I think the benchmark is usually 12 months, but different organizations can interpret that differently. It's never more than that, but some organizations might offer support and adjustments even if you've only had a disability for 6 months or 3 months. It's very much up to the organization in that term. Race, which is a really broad category, because when the Equality Act was written, there were very sort of limited ideas and understanding about what the word race meant, and that has been interpreted and opened up to include anything that sort of defines you culturally, whether it be your color, your nationality, your national origin, your ethnic origin. In some circumstances, it could include religion, even though that's a separate characteristic in itself. Your sex, so as in your biological sex, which is a problematic term, but just using it now to clarify how that's different to gender identity. There is currently a lot going on within government, and there has been 2 petitions heard yesterday in government around terminology around gender and sex. The sort of what they call the anti-trans movement want to define sex within the Equality Act to mean biological sex. And the opposing petition is to keep the Equality Act as it is now and has been for 13 years. The anti-trans side of that argument are saying that the way it is now, it lacks clarity and makes it difficult for organizations to give women essentially the protected space of single-sex spaces, where it be changing rooms, toilets, groups. One of the examples used within the original petition was a book club for women only could have men in it without the specification of having biological sex. To me personally, I think it's a load of nonsense. We've been living with the Equality Act as it is now for 13 years. We don't really need to change it. Trans women have always had access to female-only spaces, and it's really, in my view, a distraction and a campaign to limit rights rather than protect rights. But I'm digressing quite significantly. And sexual orientation is the 9th protected characteristic. So a lot is covered by the Act. And as Sophie said, this used to be very sort of disconnected under several different acts. And I think what the Equality Act has done is bring it all together, which can cause complications because there are, groups and identities that do want individual protections. But it does also give the spirit of a common cause. And as I said before, everyone has at least 5 of those protected characteristics in one way or another. We all have an age, we all have a nationality, we all have a sex, we all have a race or ethnicity, we all have a sexual orientation in one way or another. So it is really important to everybody, and it is, why an EDI action plan and strategy does need to be embedded in every organisation, even if it's a 3 or 4 person organisation, because it affects everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was really helpful.
Then, didn't I? Sorry.
No, you didn't. It was really helpful. Well, we've kind of covered the legislation now, haven't we? But obviously everyone that's on this call today doesn't just want to tick a box. And I do get really frustrated when, particularly in my role, you do get that sometimes, don't you, where people just want a policy just to tick a box for a tender or something. So let's go into, let's delve a bit deeper now then and look at, what steps can we take as business owners, as HR directors? So maybe if I start with Sophie. Sophie, do you want to sort of, what action can we take from this session?
EDI journey, it's really important to have a vision of where you want to be when it comes to equity in, say, 3 to 5 years' time. Ideally, if that can be aligned with the wider organisation strategy, if senior leadership are on board, then because it's embedded, it's sort of part of those KPIs and goals, but that's not always possible depending on context. But I think it's really important to get together at the beginning and just think, what do we want to achieve? Where are we at now? So reviewing data, benchmarking a little bit, doing a bit of an internal EDI audit to understand where are you at now? Where are your strengths potentially? Where are the limitations? And what do you need to work towards? And then once you've got that vision in mind and a sort of plan going ahead, I think it's important to ensure through every stage of the employee lifestyle, you're trying to embed EDI. So whether that's recruitment, development, progression, people returning from maternity leave, ensuring that policies are inclusive, and kind of covering all bases. So for example, you did the webinar on menopause quite recently. That is sort of covered by age to some extent, sex to some extent, and potentially disability to some extent, but it's kind of not explicitly covered in the Equality Act. So it's really important to point to that with policies and ensure that everyone is sort of protected and everyone is being considered when it comes to EDI interventions, and also the sort of nuances of potentially intersectional identities, intersectionality being the way that different characteristics sort of work together to create a unique lived experience. So it started off with intersectional feminism, which was basically saying we can't just look at gender on its own, because the experience of a Black woman will differ from a white woman, and looking at all sorts of different characteristics. So I think it's really important to be intersectional in approaches to EDI and not just sort of silo the different 9 characteristics, but sort of look at them and how they work together, but also beyond. So for example, social class and socioeconomic status is not explicitly covered in the Equality Act, but that doesn't mean that you don't need to consider it when it comes to EDI interventions. I think it's always useful to understand people's unique contexts. Yeah, so that's a bit of an overview of what I'd say, but I'd be very interested to hear Pippa's perspective from being an internal EDI leader.
Absolutely. And Pippa, I suppose we've just touched on sorts of policies there, haven't we? And again, to my point before about this tick box exercise, the amount of people that just pull EDI template, you know, off Google and then put it in the handbook and that's it. So could you maybe give us a little bit of guidance there and where we start?
Well, yeah, I mean, as you say, policies and procedures are important. Even though I worked with an HR manager once who honestly believed that everybody read all of the policies. And I pointed out that probably nobody read any of the policies, but they are there as a safety net when something does go wrong or when something does happen. And you need to ensure that not, as you say, you haven't just got a tokenistic inclusion of a policy, you know, that covers pregnancy or menopause. All of your policies need to be reviewed at once. So, you know, at the beginning of your EDI journey for your organization, I would say review every policy through an EDI lens. And if you need to get somebody in to do that, then do that, to make sure the language is inclusive, to make sure that when you're talking about maternity, you're not just talking about women, you're talking about people who have wombs, because you might have a trans man who is pregnant or has had a baby, or a non-binary person who still hopes to have children. You know, there's so many nuances to consider that if you don't have an EDI background, it is going to be really difficult to consider every element. So I would say when you're reviewing your policies, do an equality impact assessment, consult with an external group, get opinions from people with those lived experience, rather than trying to apply something that you can't possibly know all about everything yourself. I don't know all about everything myself. You know, when we review our policies now at Live, we refer to the EDI group as part of our quality impact assessment and get them to give their input. We're currently looking at a new recruitment system. And again, you know, we went through the questions, how they're phrased, how the wording is used, the language we used, really simple things. When you get something off the shelf, you know, one of the guys in the group pointed out that the religion list option was not inclusive enough. And it was like, well, we can't list every single religion for fear of missing one. So give an option for people to complete that field themselves and self-describe, and that applies to gender identity as well. You know, having an option to self-describe is really important. But then again, the recruitment system we've bought off the shelf makes that really difficult because there's a lot of limitations. So it's embedding your understanding of EDI and your workforce's understanding of EDI and how it applies to them into every policy that you do. I mean, there are so many things I want to talk about, but we are running out of time, I know. But I think one of the most important things when you're starting out on an EDI journey, if you are in a big organization, is making sure that your executive level leaders are bought in and they are visibly bought in. Because if it is tokenistic, it will be obvious to the people who care about equity. So if you have Black female lawyers or, you know, gay apprentices who look at the senior leadership of your organization, don't see themselves, and also don't see any empathy for themselves, they're going to know about it. They're not going to be fooled by waving a pride flag and sticking it on your logo in June. It's not going to make a difference. So it's that impact of having conversations. Create a network would be a step one thing that you can do. If you don't have the workforce to have a network for every protected characteristic, that's fine. Have one network just for EDI. Work with what you've got. But there's no point in having a network unless somebody from your C-suite or somebody from your leadership team is involved in that network and included in that network and is not seen as, oh, so-and-so's here, we can't be ourselves, we can't ask the questions we want to ask. They've got to get in there, tell their own story. One of the most powerful things we did at Wakeman's was we got our managing partner to share his own story as to why EDI is important to him. And he was talking about having a disabled daughter, coming from a very working class background, working his way up, having, you know, everybody at some point has a connection to either themselves or someone else having a mental health issue. So get people to tell their stories from senior roles so that it invites others to talk about their stories and be themselves and bring them to whole selves to the organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, really, it's really important, isn't it, that we get that buy-in and it cascades down throughout the business and the organisation, regardless of size. You know, even some of the smaller organisations I work with, you know, trying to do something and you haven't got that leadership buy-in is really transparent from the beginning.
And that feeds into your signposting as well. So, you know, I referred to our wellbeing work as the nice stuff before, and it is the nice stuff, but it's equally as important as getting your policies and procedures in order. Because when I say wellbeing, I mean you sort of your EDI calendar of events, your, you know, national what's an example? UK Disability History Month, or Pride Month, or Non-Binary People's Day, or Lesbian Day of Visibility. Those things might become like, oh God, another EDI thing on the intranet. Oh, more about diversity. But to those people in your organization who identify with that characteristic, it is saying loads about their inclusion, about their acceptance, and about them being able to come to work and not waste huge amounts of energy on pretending to be something they're not. And that's one of the main gains from having a decent EDI strategy and having a decent EDI action plan, is that you are allowing your workforce to perform to the best of their abilities without wasting energy on trying to pretend that there's something they're not trying to code switch, which is when code switching is when people disguise parts of themselves to make themselves more acceptable to the environment in which they work. So specifically with people from a minoritized ethnic group, when it comes to language or terminology or slang, quite often people will adopt a more business-like, acceptable, so to speak, way of speaking to make themselves less scary, almost less different, less sort of unapproachable, to make other people comfortable. And when you're spending a lot of energy on making other people comfortable, you're making yourself uncomfortable and making yourself exhausted and probably, less productive in your job, which is why all the studies say, having a decent diversity and inclusion is better for your organisation.
Perfect, thank you. Sophie, just bringing you back into the conversation as well. Obviously, Pippa's talked about the importance of the policies and how, and talked about sort of raising awareness of how we can live and breathe EDI. Is there else that you would suggest that we should be doing to make sure that this is just not a piece of paper?
Thinking about different parts of the organisation. So yes, policy is important, but what can we do to ensure, for example, that line managers are really inclusive in their management style? How can we train them to get them to the point where they feel confident and capable to manage colleagues with various diverse characteristics? So I think it's about ensuring that the experience of all employees is considered and that equity is embedded within those processes. So when it comes to appraisals, how can we make sure that managers are getting in touch with the colleagues in advance, making sure that they're comfortable, that they have any adjustments they need? It's just kind of checking in and having that compassionate approach so that if anyone was experiencing any challenges, they'd feel safe to raise that. So embedding that sense of psychological safety, and also speaking to what Pippa mentioned towards the end, dismantling the idea of what professional really means. Sometimes we just have certain constructs and ways of being in the workplace that aren't really needed. People don't need to talk a certain way or dress a certain way for certain roles. Sometimes you do, depending on the context, but generally speaking, it's okay to show up as yourself. And the only reason people don't feel comfortable to do so is because we have certain workplace social constructs. And as Pippa says, people will code switch or potentially mask for fear of discrimination or for fear of sort of appearing unprofessional or for standing out. And the more we can dismantle those ideas and say, actually, you're fine as you are valued for you, then people will feel safe to sort of slowly change and not have to mask or code switch quite so much.
I'm going to I've got a couple of questions that are popping up here as well. So I'm going to bring in some of these questions so that we can cover some. There's just so much, isn't it? We do definitely need a part 2. So just letting you know now. Let me know your diaries. So I've got from Hazel. Hi, Hazel. She has asked, have there been any discussions about neurodiversity specifically being included in the Equality Act, or is this included as disability?
So generally speaking, it can be covered under disability. However, I personally, being neurodiverse, would love to see it more explicitly covered. I would love to see a revision of the Equality Act so that, I think when it's clearly stated, it's less likely to sort of slip through the cracks, because sometimes it can be ambiguous whether certain things are covered under disability, for example. I'm not aware of any sort of revisions that are being planned. I don't know if Pippa can follow on there, but I think as it stands, the Equality Act is kind of going to stay as it is. And I would just say for organisations to be as inclusive as possible, to kind of cover it as a disability and provide your employee with those protections and reasonable adjustments, kind of regardless. Because if you're looking at the social model of disability, neurodivergence shouldn't be a disability, but because of the way society is structured, it can be disabling. So organisations need to sort of create the right atmosphere and put things in place so that those barriers are no longer there.
Yeah. I mean, I always say that it's implied that neurodiversity is encompassed by the Equality Act. I think there's, it's a piece of legislation that's 13 years old. It needs updating in lots of ways. And I think at the moment we've got a bit of a trickle effect of reactionary amendments being made, like the discussions that are going on at the moment around trans. There's been talk of menopause being included as a protected characteristic, which was then dismissed. There have for years been conversations around social mobility and social background being included as a protected characteristic, which I believe are currently included within Wales and maybe Scotland, but not here. So, you know, my view is that there needs to be an en masse review of the Act. But
Absolutely.
from my own personal perspective, I'd rather that happen under a different government.
I agree.
Yeah, also agree.
But I'm probably not supposed to say things like that.
Well, it's great actually, because you've just answered one of the other questions, was if you could change the Equality Act, what would you add or amend? So
I'd like it to just be
you.
given to me to rewrite.
Yeah, I think that's what we should all put a petition together now when there's a change in government.
In all seriousness, though, I think we do need a lot of EDI professionals to put in their input.
Yeah,
and it needs to come from the people who are on the ground and who have kind of interacted with workforces and understand what the needs really are.
And to your point earlier as well, those lived experiences, so important. And we should review legislation. After 13 years, things change dramatically during that time.
Yeah.
I've got another question that I'll just sneak in before the end from Azim. So he said, it's great to hear about EDI, but I feel it's driven by larger companies and large corporates, as they have the budgets and a person or team like Pippa, who are responsible to work on this specifically. We need more help on an SME level and smaller companies. So any tips on how we can start with the basics? I mean, you kind of have covered this through the session, but if there's anything else.
I mean, it is difficult. If you are a small organisations, you know, the fundamental things like networks and policies, it's hard to do. I mean, you can't really build a network of colleagues if you're an organisation of 10. But I would say the first thing you need to do is decide what it is that you want to achieve. If you're an organisation of 10 and you're concerned about equality and diversity, why are you concerned about it? What do you want to get out of taking EDI into consideration for your organisation? If you're an organisation of 10, what do those 10 people look like? Are you a cross-section of the community or society that your organisation serves? I mean, that's the main priority, is that your organisation can understand your customer base, essentially. And if your customers are all Black and brown people from working class backgrounds and your organisation is all white people from upper middle class backgrounds, there's going to be a disconnect of understanding and service. So then in that situation, your one objective is make my organisation look more like my customer base. And how do I do that? Well, I signpost, I send out a signal through my social media, through my PR, through my marketing that says, we may not be, but we aspire to be an inclusive organisation. And then when it comes to recruitment, take into account EDI as part of your, shortlisting process. Make sure that your recruitment process is, anonymized to a point, and that your advertising speaks to the people you want to attract. And if you need to use external organizations to do that, then make a bit of an investment on that front. If your interview panels are not diverse because you don't have diverse representation in your organization, bring someone in, get a consultant that can help you with that. But it's not, if you're a small organization, don't just say, oh, we need to do something about EDI. Look at why you want to do it, make it meaningful, and focus on the target of your purpose, so your audience, your customer. Do you have anything to add? Sorry, Sophie.
No, you covered that really well. That was great.
And obviously, I mean, that's a good lead for you, Sophie, in terms of that's what you guys do as well, isn't it? So you can support these sort of
absolutely. And our projects vary quite a lot. So while we do have
big budget projects, sorry, I'm losing my voice. We do also have a retained service called EDI 365, where we will come in for 2 or 3 days a month for a 6 to 18 month basis and kind of do bespoke EDI interventions for whatever the business needs at the time. So there are options such as those rather than a huge budget like audit or something like that.
Yeah, well, we've run out of time, which I'm devastated about. I know there are still some questions, so what I'll do is I will get those questions sent over to you both, if that's okay, and if you're okay to answer them, we can obviously share them so everyone will have their questions answered. But thank you so much today. It's been really, really helpful. I know I've certainly made quite a few notes already, things I'd like to action. So we are going to share Pippa's LinkedIn details, and then also if you want to connect, I'm sure you will after this session, and also Sophie. And as Sophie has mentioned, she does work for the Equal Group. There is support there, so we will send some further information if anybody would like to connect with Sophie afterwards. But thank you. We are
to send me an invite.
Going to have a session. It's going to be. Sorry, I went froze then for a second. Our next session is going to be in September now. We potentially will do something in July, maybe like a sort of speeds online networking, if that's what everybody would like to get to know the community better. So Maisie is going to send out a short survey just to see what speakers you'd like to hear from next year, because obviously we need to schedule that now, and also if you'd like to do a little bit more networking to get to know the community a bit better. But thank you to everyone today for joining, and thank you especially to Pippa and Sophie, and I will see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.